The thing about Courtroom 4 is that it smells like 1987. Not metaphorically, literally. The carpet, a brown-green situation that no living person would have chosen deliberately, had been installed during the Reagan administration and never replaced, and it had absorbed 37 years of anxiety, coffee, and the particular desperation of people who had run out of every other option before arriving here. Ruth Calloway knew this because she had been present for most of those 37 years. She had watched the carpet go from aggressively ugly to quietly historical. She had watched 3 judges rotate through the bench like seasons. She had watched the wood paneling darken, the fluorescent lights flicker and get replaced and flicker again, the American flag in the corner fade from red, white, and blue to a more honest pink, white, and gray. She had transcribed all of it. Not the carpet or the flag, those didn't speak, but everything that happened in front of them she had. 34 years of testimony, objection, verdict, and grief, captured through her fingers at an average of 220 words per minute, fed into a stenography machine that her colleague Dennis once described as a prop from a movie about stenography machines, and that Ruth described as hers. Its name, technically, was a Stentura 8000. Her name for it was nothing. She had never named it, but she understood its moods the way you understand the moods of something you have depended on long enough that the dependence has become its own form of intimacy. It jammed when the humidity crossed a certain threshold. It developed a faint rattle in cold weather, somewhere in the left housing, that she had learned to absorb through the heel of her palm without breaking rhythm. It had been repaired 4 times and threatened with replacement twice, and both times Ruth had filled out the requisition forms for the new model and then quietly not submitted them. She was 61 years old. She had been married once briefly in her 30s to a man named Carl who was kind and restless in equal measure and who eventually relocated both qualities to Tucson. She had a daughter named Peg who called on Sundays and a cat named Nothing in particular. She had a pattern with names, who sat on the transcript binders when they were stacked on the kitchen table, which was often. She lived 12 minutes from the Glacier County Federal Courthouse in a town in northwestern Montana that had a grain elevator, 2 bars, a hardware store, and a level of collective quietness that suited her completely. She had been offered positions in Billings, once in Helena, and had declined both with the same 2 words: "I'm fine." She was fine. She was more than fine. She was the kind of fine that people mistake for smallness until they need something done precisely and without drama, at which point they understand it was never smallness at all. Dale Morrow v. Veritech Pharmaceuticals, Inc., arrived in Courtroom 4 on a Tuesday in October, which in northwestern Montana means the light is doing something extraordinary outside, and everyone inside is pretending not to notice. Ruth had read the case summary the night before, as she always did. She had learned early in her career that walking into a trial cold was like walking into a film halfway through, technically manageable, but you missed the grammar of it, the logic underneath the words. The case summary told her the following. Dale Morrow, 53, a high school shop teacher from Whitefish, was suing Veritech Pharmaceuticals for the wrongful death of his daughter, Sadie Morrow, 19, who had died 11 months earlier from cardiac arrest following a prescribed course of Veritech's drug Clarinox, an anti-inflammatory approved 18 months prior, currently under FDA review, currently being prescribed to approximately 400,000 patients nationwide. Dale was represented by a lawyer named George Ahrens who operated out of a 2-person firm in Kalispell and had, according to his firm's website, a passion for justice and 20 years of experience. The website had a stock photo of Scales. Ruth had seen enough trial lawyers to know that George Ahrens was a good man doing his absolute best in a room that had been architecturally designed to favor the other side. The other side was Harriet Sloan. Harriet Sloan was 51, lead litigation counsel for Veritech's external firm, flown in from Chicago, and she had the particular quality of extremely intelligent people who have decided that warmth is inefficient. She wore charcoal. She wore it every day of the trial, different suits, same color, like a personal policy. She carried a leather portfolio that Ruth estimated cost more than Ruth's car payment, and she set it on the defense table each morning with a precision that was almost architectural. Ruth noticed these things. She had spent 34 years making herself invisible in rooms where visibility meant bias. A stenographer who reacted was a stenographer who contaminated the record. She had trained herself into a particular quality of presence, alert, absorptive, expressionless, that her daughter Peg called your courtroom face, and that Ruth preferred to think of as professional discipline. But she noticed, she always noticed. She just didn't write down what she noticed. She wrote down what was said. The machine on day one jammed at 9:14 a.m., 11 minutes into opening arguments, when George Aarons said the word reprehensible and the left housing did its thing. Ruth cleared it in 4 seconds without looking down, without missing a word, without altering her expression. She had cleared it in darkness once, during a power outage. She could clear it in her sleep. She almost had once. Dale Morrow took the stand on day 2. He was a big man, the kind of big that comes from actual physical labor rather than intention, with hands that looked like they had been borrowed from someone even larger and never quite returned. He wore a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who only own one suit, which is to say it fit him the way a compromise fits a problem, adequately, without conviction. He had a photograph. Ruth noticed it because she noticed everything, and because it was slightly unusual, a small photograph, wallet-sized, that he carried into the witness box in his left hand and set face down on the railing in front of him when he sat. Not face up, where it might look performative. Face down, where only he knew it was there. Ruth thought about that for a moment and then stopped thinking about it, because the record was beginning and the record required her full attention. George Aarons walked Dale through it gently, the way you walk someone through a place they have already been hurt. The chronology: Sadie's knee injury in her first semester at University of Montana, the orthopedic referral, the Clarinox prescription, the initial improvement. The 6 weeks that followed, the morning in February when Sadie's roommate knocked on her door at 11, and the door opened, and everything that could be lost was already lost. Dale mispronounced Clarinox every time. Clarinox with the emphasis wrong, slightly differently each time, like a word he had read but never heard spoken, or heard spoken only in the worst possible context, and couldn't locate the neutral version of it anymore. Ruth transcribed Clarinox, correct each time without commentary. She noticed the photograph move slightly when Dale's hand pressed against the railing. She noticed the way he paused before every answer, not evasively, but carefully, the way a man pauses who has learned that words have consequences and is still not entirely sure how. She noticed that he looked at George Aarons when he spoke, not at the jury, which was technically correct behavior and also suggested nobody had coached him, which suggested George Aarons was working with what he had. Then Harriet Sloane stood up. What Harriet Sloane did to Dale Morrow's testimony was not cruel in any way that left fingerprints. She did not raise her voice. She did not imply that he was lying. She did not use the photograph against him, did not reference Sadie's age or face or name more than absolutely necessary. She was, in the technical sense, respectful. What she did was build a structure around Dale's grief, and then show the jury how the structure made his grief irrelevant. Had Dale read the prescribing information? He had not, or rather, he had tried, and it was 17 pages, and he had read the first 4. Had he discussed the cardiac risk disclosure with Sadie's doctor? He hadn't been present at that appointment. Sadie was 19. Was he aware that Sadie had a previously undetected mitral valve abnormality that the autopsy had confirmed? He was aware. Had Veritex prescribing guidelines included a recommendation against Clarinox for patients with undiagnosed cardiac abnormalities? They had. Did Dale understand that an undiagnosed condition, by definition, could not have been disclosed to Veritex? Each question landed like something being bolted into place. By the end of cross-examination, Dale Morrow looked like a man who had driven himself to his own funeral and was only now reading the program. He looked like someone who had brought a photograph of his daughter into a courtroom and discovered that the courtroom did not have a mechanism for photographs. He stepped down from the witness box with his hand closed around the picture, and Ruth, who had not altered her expression in 34 years of testimony, kept her eyes on her machine. The machine jammed again at 3:47 p.m. She cleared it in 3 seconds. She did not look up. She found it at 2:11 a.m. on a Thursday. This was not unusual. Ruth reviewed her daily transcripts each night, not because the courthouse required it, not because anyone checked, but because 34 years of professional discipline had calcified into something indistinguishable from character. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table with the transcript on her laptop and her paper backup beside it, and the cat on the binder stack doing what the cat did, which was exist heavily and without apology. The witness in question was Dr. Philip Acaffer, Veritech's medical expert, a pharmacologist from Northwestern who had spent day 3 explaining, in language carefully calibrated to be comprehensible without being simple, why Clarinox was not the proximate cause of Sadie Morrow's death. Ruth had transcribed Dr. Acaffer for 6 hours and 40 minutes. She found the gap on page 47. It was not a dramatic gap. It did not announce itself. It was a continuity error, the kind that a person reads past unless they have a specific reason to read slowly, or unless they have been trained for 34 years to understand that every word in a courtroom record exists in relationship to every other word, and that a gap in that relationship is not a formatting issue. It was a missing sentence. Ruth went back to her paper backup. She kept paper backups because she was 61 and had watched enough digital systems fail catastrophically to trust redundancy over efficiency, and found the sentence there. In her own shorthand, in her own hand, on page 47 of the paper record. Dr. Acaffer had said, in response to George Aaron's redirect, "I should note that the internal study I referenced, the Veritech phase III data, was not the version submitted to the FDA. There is a second dataset." 1 sentence, 29 words. Then George Aaron's had been interrupted by Harriet Sloan's objection. The objection had been sustained, and the line of questioning had ended. In the official digital transcript, the one filed with the court, the one that constituted the legal record, the sentence did not exist. The objection existed. The sustained ruling existed. What preceded them did not. Ruth sat with this for a long time. The cat moved from the binder stacked to the chair across from her and regarded her with the particular blankness of a creature that has no investment in the outcome. She thought about 34 years of invisibility. She thought about the discipline of the record, the sanctity of it, the way she had organized her entire professional life around the idea that the record was the truth and her job was to protect the truth by capturing it precisely and then getting out of its way. She thought about Dale Morrow's hand on the photograph railing. She thought about a second dataset. She made another cup of tea, which she did not drink, and at 4:30 a.m. she went to bed, and she lay in the dark for an hour and a half thinking about what kind of person she was, and then she got up and got dressed because she already knew. She went to Martin Frey first. Martin Frey was the court clerk, her immediate supervisor, a man of 58 who had worked in Glacier County Federal Administration for 22 years, and who had the institutional temperature of a person who had long ago made peace with the idea that systems were more durable than individuals, and that the correct response to most problems was to let the system process them. She brought her paper back up. She showed him page 47. She showed him the corresponding page in the digital record. She explained, in the precise and organized way she explained things, what the discrepancy meant and what it suggested about the integrity of the official court record. Martin looked at the paper backup. He looked at the digital record. He looked at Ruth. "These transcripts are official the moment they're filed," he said. "The digital record is the record. My paper backup reflects what was said in that courtroom. Your paper backup is a working document. It's not the filed record. It's accurate." "Ruth." Martin set down the paper backup with the careful gentleness of a man returning something he wished had never been handed to him. A stenographer's handwritten notes are not admissible as a challenge to the official filed transcript. You know this. "I know the rules of evidence," Ruth said. "I'm not talking about evidence. I'm talking about the record being wrong. If you believe there's an error in the transcript, you submit a correction through standard channels. You note the discrepancy. Your supervisor reviews it. You're my supervisor." A pause. "And if there's a determination that a correction is warranted, the filed transcript is amended. And if there isn't a determination that a correction is warranted." Martin Frey looked at her with something that was almost sympathy and not quite courage. "Then the record stands as filed." Ruth picked up her paper backup. She looked at Martin for a moment, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the particular clarity of a person who has just received the information they needed and will now proceed accordingly. "Thank you, Martin," she said. She did not go to George Aarons directly. She understood enough about the mechanics of judicial procedure to know that a stenographer approaching a plaintiff's attorney with undisclosed information was a breach that could compromise the information itself. It had to go through channels. The channels were inadequate, so she had to find a channel that wasn't officially a channel but would function as one. She went to the court's judicial integrity officer, a position that sounds more powerful than it is, occupied in Glacier County by a woman named Sandra Holt who worked half-time and whose office was adjacent to the record storage room and smelled correspondingly of old paper, which Ruth found appropriate. Ruth laid out the discrepancy to Sandra Holt with the same precision she had used with Martin Frey and received a substantially different response. Sandra Holt read the paper backup, read it again, looked at the digital record, said nothing for almost 2 minutes. "How confident are you in your paper record?" Sandra asked. "It reflects what was said." "That's not what I asked." "I've been transcribing for 34 years, Ruth said. "I am completely confident in my paper record." Sandra Holt nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are making a decision that they know will generate paperwork. "I'm going to need to flag this for the presiding judge. You understand that triggers a formal review process." "I understand." "The trial will likely be delayed." "I understand." "And you'll be asked to provide testimony about your transcription process as a witness, which means you won't be able to continue as stenographer on this case." Ruth had known this was coming since 2:11 a.m. "I understand," she said. "You're sure you want to do this?" It wasn't quite a question. Ruth answered it anyway. "The record is wrong," she said. "That's the only thing I'm sure about. Everything else follows from that." What followed was not clean. Nothing about it was clean. The judicial review took 11 days. During those 11 days, the trial was suspended. Both legal teams were notified. Veritech's attorneys filed 3 motions in 4 days, and George Aarons, who had not been told the specific content of the discrepancy, but had been told there was one, sat in his office in Kalispell and apparently did not sleep, based on his appearance at the subsequent hearings. Ruth gave her testimony about her transcription process to the reviewing judge, the Honorable Claire Mabry, in a closed session that lasted 4 hours. She brought her paper backup. She brought her maintenance logs for the Stentura 8000, which she had kept meticulously because she was Ruth. She brought her training certifications, her 34 years of employment records, and a calm that the judge later described. In a conversation Ruth was not present for but heard about secondhand, as slightly unnerving. The gap in the digital transcript was confirmed. How it had occurred was less clearly established. The court's digital transcription system, which ran parallel to Ruth's machine as a backup, had logged an anomaly during the filing process. Whether the anomaly was technical or deliberate was a question that the judicial review declined to definitively answer, which is a specific kind of answer. The missing sentence was restored to the official record. George Aarons, once he read it, filed a motion to reopen discovery within 24 hours. The motion was granted. Veritech's legal team requested a continuance. The continuance was granted for 6 weeks. Ruth was reassigned from the case. She was not fired. She was reassigned to administrative duties, pending the review's conclusion. In the language of institutional management, that means, you did something we cannot punish you for, and we are going to make it uncomfortable anyway. Martin Frey was polite to her. Harriet Sloane's team never spoke to her directly. The judge, in passing her in the hallway once, made brief eye contact and gave the smallest possible nod. Dale Morrow never knew her name. She had been present for the most consequential moment of his legal case, had made it possible, and was entirely invisible to him, which was, she thought, precisely correct. She had not done it to be seen. She had done it because the record was wrong and she was the person who had found the error, and she did not know how to be the kind of person who finds an error in the record and leaves it there. The machine, sitting in its case in the reassignment office, jammed once while she was running a test print. She cleared it without looking down. The trial concluded 14 months after it began. The verdict was not the verdict Dale Morrow had needed. The jury found Veritech liable, a finding made possible in part by the discovery reopened after the restored sentence led to the production of the second dataset, which demonstrated that Veritech's internal researchers had flagged cardiac risk concerns in the phase III data before submission, and that those concerns had been. The documentary record showed this with the patient clarity of emails that were never meant to become exhibits, set aside during the regulatory filing process. Veritech was found liable. The damages awarded were a fraction of what George Aarons had sought. Veritech's appellate team was already constructing their response before the jury foreman finished reading. Dale Morrow, sitting at the plaintiff's table in his one suit, looked like a man who had won a foot race and arrived at the finish line to discover the finish line was not where anyone had said it would be. It was not justice. It was something was different from nothing, George Aarons told a reporter from the Kalispell paper, and the reporter quoted it, and Ruth read it at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning and thought, yes, that is accurate. Something is different from nothing. That is the most honest thing anyone had said about this case in 14 months. She was retired by then. The retirement had not been forced. It had been offered, with a pension that reflected her 34 years of service and the particular institutional generosity that organizations extend when they want someone to leave in a way that doesn't look like they wanted someone to leave. Ruth had accepted it. She was 61. She had been in that building for 34 years. She knew every creak in the floor of courtroom 4, every flicker pattern of the lights in the east corridor, the exact temperature differential between the records room and the hallway outside it. She had transcribed more words in that building than she would speak in 10 lifetimes. She brought the machine home. It sat in the corner of her living room in its case, next to the bookshelf that held 34 years of professional reference material and one framed photograph of Peg at her college graduation. The cat ignored it with the pointed deliberateness of an animal registering a territorial change. Ruth's Sundays acquired a different texture. Peg called. Ruth made tea and drank it now, the whole cup. She read. She walked. She discovered that the town had a community garden 2 blocks from the hardware store that she had apparently driven past for a decade without registering, and she signed up for a plot, and she grew things that were ordinary and imperfect in hers. She did not miss the courtroom exactly. She missed the record. The act of capture, the discipline of catching every word and holding it, had been the organizing principle of her professional life for so long that its absence felt not like freedom, but like a new kind of silence that she was still learning to furnish. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in December, 8 months after her retirement. It was handwritten, which she noticed. Nobody handwrote letters. The return address was Missoula. The handwriting was careful in the way that young people's handwriting is careful when they are making an effort, slightly oversized, slightly deliberate, the letters of someone who learned cursive and uses it infrequently. Dear Ms. Calloway, you don't know me. My name is Anna Vesper. I was Sadie Morrow's roommate at U of M. I was the one who found her. Ruth set the letter down, picked it up again. I came to the courthouse on the 4th day of the trial because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I sat in the gallery for about 2 hours. Most of it I didn't understand, the legal language, the way the arguments worked. But I watched you. I don't know if you're aware of how you look when you work. You probably aren't because you're working. But from where I was sitting, you looked like the only person in that room who was getting everything. Not interpreting it, not filtering it, just getting it, all of it, every word. I didn't know what you did. I looked it up afterward. I found out that you were the one who caught the error in the transcript. I don't know how I found that out. Courthouse gossip travels, I guess, even to people who aren't really part of the courthouse. Someone mentioned your name in connection with the judicial review. I'm in a paralegal program now at I start my 2nd year in January. I've thought a lot about why I'm doing it, and I think the honest answer is that I watched you work for 2 hours in a courtroom when you didn't know anyone was watching you, and I understood for the first time that there are people whose entire job is to make sure the record is right. Not to win, not to argue, just to make sure what happened is what the record says happened. Sadie would have liked that. She was a person who cared about things being accurate. She used to correct menus. I don't really have anything to ask you. I just wanted you to know that I saw you, and that it mattered. Anna Vesper. Ruth read the letter once. She folded it along its original creases, the careful folds of someone who had folded it thoughtfully before sealing it, and she held it for a moment. And then she walked to the corner of the living room where the Stentura 8000 sat in its case. She unlatched the case. The machine looked the way it always looked, functional and unpretty, worn in the specific places where her hands had worn it, carrying the faint ghost of 34 years of rooms and words and people who had needed the truth caught and held. She set the letter on top of it. The cat jumped up onto the case, circled once, and settled beside the letter with its eyes half closed. Outside, December was conducting its business, gray sky, a film of ice on the street, the grain elevator lit yellow against the dark. The town was quiet in the way that towns are quiet when everyone has somewhere to be and is being there. Ruth stood at the window for a while and looked at it. She thought about Anna Vesper sitting in the gallery of courtroom 4 on a day, when Ruth had been doing exactly what she had done every day for 34 years, which was to make herself invisible in service of the record, and how the invisibility had been seen anyway. She thought about Dale Morrow's hand on the photograph. She thought about the sentence on page 47, 29 words, the way they had sat in her paper backup for 11 days while she waited for the process to work, not knowing if the process would work, understanding that the process might simply absorb the error and continue, understanding that processes do that institutions do that the record is not self-correcting. It requires a person who catches the error and decides they cannot leave it there. She thought about what Anna had written. There are people whose entire job is to make sure the record is right. Not to win, not to argue, just to make sure what happened is what the record says happened. Ruth had never thought of it in those words exactly. She had thought of it as discipline, as professional obligation, as the particular pride of a person who does precise work precisely. She had not thought of it as something visible. She had not thought of it as something that could be seen from the gallery and carried out of the building and into a life. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She came back and sat in the chair across from the machine and the cat and the letter, and she drank the whole cup while the December light did what December light does in Montana, which is fail early and without apology, leaving the room to its lamps and its quiet. The machine sat in its case. It did not jam. Ruth thought, 34 years, and that's the most remarkable thing it's done all week. And then she thought about that for a moment, the way something ordinary becomes remarkable simply by being, finally, uninterrupted. And she understood that this was what Anna had seen and what she herself had spent a career doing. Not performing, not arguing, not winning. Holding the space open, making sure the pause between what was said and what was recorded was as short and as honest as she could make it. 34 years of that. 34 years of sitting in rooms where history was being made in the small, grinding, unglamorous way that most history is actually made. Not in speeches or verdicts, but in the words before the speeches, the records behind the verdicts, the 29 sentences that fall through gaps when nobody is watching. Except when somebody is. Except when the person sitting in the corner with the worn machine and the paper backup, and the 34 years of knowing exactly what she heard is watching, and will not look away, and will not leave the error in the record simply because leaving it there would be easier, because some things are not about easier. Some things are about the record being right. And in the end, sitting in her living room in a town in Montana in December, retired, her machine in the corner, a letter from a girl who had watched her on the worst day of that girl's life and decided to become someone who protected records too, Ruth Calloway thought that was enough. More than enough. It was everything she had meant to do.